Hi guys, welcome to Macro Chemistry. So here we are in another video, and I actually wanted to make this one for quite some time now. It will be about caffeine, which you all know and love, and I'm going to show you how to extract it from two different sources, and later I'm going to make something that I call the Reader Bowl. But first, let's talk a little bit about caffeine. It is the world's most consumed drug, and that's because to develop it in school or at work is quite difficult without it. Caffeine is naturally present in some plants, which use it as a natural pesticide to fight off bugs, and it has the side effect of making you feel more energized. It is also quite addictive, and lots of people depend on it just to survive everyday life. It is also present in a lot of foods, such as chocolate, tea and cocoa, although the most popular source of it is undoubtedly coffee. This is what I'm going to be extracting it from today, and the procedure for that is actually quite simple. The first ingredient is of course some coffee. It can be ground or instant, the type doesn't really matter here, I used around 20 grams. The second major ingredient is a non-polar solvent, of which you are going to need around 80 milliliters. Here you can go with chloroform or DCM, although I wouldn't recommend chloroform because, you know, chloroform. The third ingredient is 10 grams of baking soda, otherwise known as sodium bicarbonate, but you can also use sodium carbonate. You are also going to need some 95% ethanol for crystallization. If you would want to extract caffeine from tea, the procedure is exactly the same, so there is no need for me to show it here, another reason being that I screwed up and my yield was so low that my scale couldn't even measure it. So, after this Nile Red style introduction, I can now start the extraction. The first step is to get a picker and add the coffee followed by baking soda and some water, roughly 5 times the volume of coffee. After mixing the ingredients, I turned on my hot plate and let the mixture cook for a few minutes. What I am essentially making here is just some super strong coffee, and the baking soda is to make some compounds in coffee more water soluble, because they can contaminate our precious caffeine later on. When the coffee has done cooking, I took it off the hot plate and proceeded to filter it using a coffee filter, which for once was actually used for its real purpose in a lab. After filtering the coffee for just under 6 hours, which is like 5 lab minutes, I was left with a beaker full of clean and caffeine-rich lab coffee. For the next step, I got outside to not only touch some grass, but also to avoid toxic DCM fumes going into my house. I also had to put my respirator on, and that made me sound kinda like Darth Vader. Now that I have the coffee, I need to selectively pull out the caffeine from all of the organic impurities, and to do that I'm going to need a separatory funnel and some DCM. The caffeine is way more soluble in the DCM than in water, and when the two liquids are mixed, it will go into the DCM layer. Unfortunately, some other compounds from coffee are also more soluble in DCM, and that is why I added the baking soda earlier. It converted them into more polar and water-soluble compounds, less likely to be picked up by the DCM. So now to begin the extraction, I poured all of the coffee into a separatory funnel, followed by around 25 ml of the DCM. This time I actually closed the valve before pouring the liquids, because when I extracted the tea, I forgot to do that and it ruined my yield. That sometimes happens to everyone, right? After the liquids were poured, I sealed the funnel with a stopper and started to gently shake it, while also opening the valve sometimes to release any produced gases. It is important to shake the liquids very gently, because otherwise an emulsion might form, which is very difficult to separate. After a few minutes of shaking, I placed the separatory panel back on the stand and allowed the layers to appear again. When the layers were visible again, I slowly drained the lower DCM one, and as you can see it became a bit yellow, which in this single case is actually a good indicator of progress. I repeated the exact same washing step 2 more times, and after I was done, I discarded the coffee layer and was left with around 80 ml of the caffeine extract. It was quite cloudy because there was some water dissolved into it, so I prepared a saturated cooking salt solution and washed the extract with it. After the washing, it was no longer cloudy and instead looked kinda like pee. The next step in extracting the caffeine is to get rid of the DCM, and that can be done by distillation or just boiling it away. I'm going to go with the boiling method because I tried the distillation with the tea, but that ended up destroying my yield even more, and I recovered only about 20% of the DCM. So, to boil it down, I placed it on a hot plate and proceeded to lightly heat it over 2 hours. DCM has a boiling point of only around 40 degrees Celsius, so there is no need for high temperatures. After the boiling was done, I was left with a brown crust on the bottom of the beaker, which smelled very nice, probably because some of the coffee's essential oils got pulled along the caffeine. I actually had more than I anticipated, but this caffeine still wasn't pure, and to satisfy my picky addiction, I wanted to make it as pure as possible. To do that, I need to carry out a procedure called recrystallization, which will leave me with pure caffeine crystals. Firstly, I need to dissolve the crude caffeine in some kind of solvent, so I choose some pure spirit, aka 95% ethanol. To begin the recrystallization, I put my impure caffeine in this cute little beaker and slowly added portions of ethanol under strong heating. The goal here is to dissolve the caffeine in the smallest amount of solvent possible. The solvent also has to be hot because it will be able to dissolve more caffeine. After everything has dissolved, I transfer the mixture onto a watch glass to allow it to slowly cool. What's happening here is that the dissolved caffeine becomes more insoluble as temperature decreases, allowing it to drop out of the solution and form crystals. The impurities remain dissolved, and that allows me to separate them using filtration. After a few hours in the fridge, it looked like most of the caffeine has crystallized to form some beautiful, needle-like crystals. I was very happy that it worked, because considering my previous tea extraction, this was much better. So, the last step in purifying the caffeine is filtration, which is actually very scary, because I could potentially lose it all. What I need to do here is to vacuum filter the crystals and wash them with some ethanol. The ethanol could potentially dissolve them, and to avoid that, I put it in the freezer, which will cool it, so it will not destroy my precious caffeine. When everything was ready, I nervously put the crystals into the filter, turned on the vacuum, and slowly washed them with the cooled ethanol. Fortunately, everything went well, and I was left with some fluffy and clean caffeine crystals. Now it was time to weigh them, and when I put them on a scale, nothing showed up. This time I know that I have a measurable amount, so to figure out how much I have, I got one caffeine pill, weighed it, and compared the difference when I put my caffeine on the scale with it. This This method worked, and I was finally able to calculate that I had around 60 mg of pure caffeine, which was a terrible yield equivalent to about 1 glass of coffee, but I kinda expected it. Extraction of caffeine from tea or coffee is a very inefficient process, and if you want some real yield, you must use some caffeine pills. And that is exactly what I will do now. I brought a very cheap bottle of caffeine pills, which has 200 tablets, each one having 200 mg of caffeine. Using some advanced math, I figured out that I can extract up to 40 grams of pure caffeine, which is actually enough to kill an average person 4 times. Anyway, for this extraction you are going to need just some DCM, caffeine pills and 95% ethanol. Before extracting the caffeine, it is good to look into the ingredients list of the pills you have, because they might contain some difficult to separate things in them. Fortunately for me, mine contained just cellulose, caffeine and some magnesium salts, which is pretty good because in theory I could use just water to extract the caffeine. I am going to use both the DCM and water methods though, to show you how each one of them looks. For both of them, I am going to have to turn the pills into a powder, and to do that, instead of using the old and boring mortar, I went with my favorite method, the Ziploc bag and the hammer one. This method produces some nice ASMR sounds, but unfortunately it didn't crush the pills well enough, so I had to use the mortar. After the pills were turned into a nice powder, I got them into a beaker and started to pour in some DCM. I again had to do this outside and in a respirator, because DCM fumes are pretty toxic. After letting the mixture sit for a little, I filtered it using a coffee filter. When all of the DCM came over, I added a little bit more to get as much of the caffeine as I could. At this point, I thought that I have extracted almost all of the caffeine, but after I let everything sit outside overnight, I saw tons of white crystals forming on the filter paper and inside the DCM extract. I decided to extract them later and was ready to move on, but at the same time, I noticed that there was something in my other beaker. It turned out that a snail got inside the beaker when there was still some caffeine left in it, and it managed to overdose it and die. This is very sad, but it is a perfect example of what happens when you overdose caffeine, so don't do that unless you want to end up as this poor little snail. Anyway, after giving the snail a burial, I proceeded to the next step in the caffeine extraction. What I had to do now was to boil down the DCM, and because a lot of it has already evaporated, it didn't take too long. After all of it was gone, I was left with a very fluffy caffeine cake, and I gotta say, it looked pretty high quality. I weighted it, and it turned out that I had around 14 grams of caffeine, which wasn't even half of the theoretical yield, so now I proceeded to extract the rest. It was still sitting in the filter along the cellulose, so firstly, I had to get it out of there. After that was done, I filled the beaker with some distilled water and turned on the heating. The water dissolves much less of the caffeine than the DCM, so here I had to use a lot of it. When it was nice and warm, I sprinkled in some of the caffeine containing powder along with the paper filter. I also put in the big chunk I had taken out of the filter, and at that point I realized that this beaker couldn't contain it all. I am not rich enough to have some big beakers, so I turned to the only logical solution, which was a big old jar. So, after transferring everything into it, I added more water and cooked it for some time. In the meantime, I set up a coffee filter mounted on a metal rod that actually was higher than my workspace, and thank God there was a perfectly positioned hole in its roof. After filtering the water, I had to boil it down, which would take tons of time, so to speed things up, under the filter I placed a heated pan, which creates a 1000 IQ machine that does two things at once. After leaving it running overnight, I saw a nice white crust of caffeine. There were even some crystals, but I decided to scrape them off and purify them even more. Before the purification, I weighted all of the caffeine, and it turned out that it had achieved a 101% yield, which was very suspicious, but that was probably due to some impurities and residual water. To remove the water, I placed it in a beaker on a hot plate, but instead of drying, it decided to melt, and what I have now is basically liquid caffeine. I don't know how I did that, but when it was still a liquid, I decided to have fun with it and created a caffeine popsicle. I wouldn't recommend even caffeine addicts licking it though, because you know, it's pure caffeine. Anyway, for the next step, I diluted the melted caffeine with some water for everything to dissolve, and when it was ready, I put it into a filter that was above the extracted caffeine from earlier, so that the filtered caffeine will combine with it. A pretty interesting thing is that the droplets seem to instantly disappear after touching the dry caffeine. The caffeine solution in the filter was so concentrated that after a few minutes it spontaneously crystallized, and to filter it I had to dissolve it with more water. After everything eventually came through, I put it into the fridge to crystallize out. After I came back the next day, I saw that the beaker had turned from yellow to completely white, and instead of a liquid it was now a solid and full of beautiful and clean caffeine crystals. I mean, just take a look at that, isn't it beautiful? Now that I have the crystals, I have to separate them from the water and wash them, and to do that, I assembled my trusty vacuum filter and began sucking the water out. You can see that all of the impurities remain dissolved in the filtered water, and I am left with some pure caffeine crystals. They are still wet though, and to dry them, I put them on a hot plate for a couple of hours. My final yield was 29 grams, which was pretty good. There were still 11 grams of caffeine which I didn't extract, but I don't care since now I have more than enough to do what I wanted. And speaking of that, I am going to need some Red Bull. I brought one can a few days ago, and today I am going to level it up to what I call the Reader Bull. As you may know, a normal 250ml can of Red Bull has 80mg of caffeine, but after you get addicted to caffeine, this is not that much. This is exactly the case for me, so instead of 80mg, I am going to ramp it up 35 times and make a can of Red Bull containing 3 grams of caffeine. To do that, I opened the Red Bull can, wrapped it in an artistic cover, weighted out 3 grams of my freshly made caffeine, and poured it directly into the can. Unfortunately, it started to foam a lot, so I transferred it into a beaker and proceeded to add the rest of the caffeine. When it had finally dissolved, I poured it back into the can and took a sip to taste it. It tasted like a normal Red Bull, maybe a little more bitter, because caffeine has a very bitter taste. I only took a sip, because in that sip there was more caffeine than in the whole can of normal Red Bull. If I drank the whole can at once, I would probably get very sick, so I had to be very careful. I saved the rest for some difficult school exams coming up, so that it won't be wasted. So there you have it. If you enjoyed the video, you can like, comment, and subscribe, and see you in the next one.